You ever feel like some random person, some careless comment, or some small inconvenience can hijack your entire day? Like suddenly your heart's racing, your mind's spinning, and you're stuck replaying the moment, wondering how someone could be so disrespectful, so clueless, or so wrong. What if I told you there is one mental shift that, when mastered, cuts the power out from under that anger and irritation, so that no one and nothing can bother you like that again? It's not magic. It's a principle that ancient Stoics built their whole lives around, and it's shockingly practical, even today, when chaos is constant and people are trigger-happy. The core of this shift is realizing where your power truly lies. The Stoics, way back, didn't just preach calm as a nice idea. They mapped out what's in your control versus what isn't. Epictetus, one of the greatest teachers of this school, boiled it down to a razor-sharp truth. Your opinions, your desires, your aversions, your actions, those are yours. Everything else, your body, your reputation, other people's actions, those aren't. When we confuse what's not ours for something we can own, we become vulnerable to disturbance, blame, and misery. But when we see clearly what we can actually control, we free ourselves from that slavery. Imagine this. Someone cuts you off in traffic, or a colleague undermines you, or a family member says something cruel. Your first reflex is to feel insulted, outraged, to blame them, to stew. That reflex is exactly what Stoicism teaches us to catch and question. It's not the event that forces your emotional state. It's your judgment about the event that does. Epictetus phrased it bluntly. People are disturbed not by things themselves, but by the ideas they form about them. In other words, anger isn't a direct reaction to an insult. It's a reaction to the judgment that the insult is unbearable or unjust. Once you grasp that, you see that the disturbance is coming from inside, from your own interpretation. So what do you do when that old trigger fires? You stop, breathe, and immediately ask yourself, is this within my control or not? This question is a weapon. It gives you a moment to shift from automatic outrage to intentional response. You don't have to pretend you're fine. You don't have to swallow your feelings. Just recognize what you can actually change. You can change your response, your tone, your next decision. You cannot change the past, the other person's words, or the way they chose to behave. That's the borderline. Own what's yours. Don't chase what's not. And peace starts showing up the instant you refuse to let the uncontrollable barge into your inner kingdom. Now, you might think, okay, cool. But real life isn't a quiet meditation room. Real life is messy, with deadlines, markets, relationships, and people who seem determined to test you. That's exactly why this practice is powerful. The Stoics weren't ascetics hiding from the world. They were in the world, trading, teaching, even in politics. And they still insisted on mastering this boundary between control and chaos. The system they built wasn't just ethics. It was a full philosophy covering logic, physics, and ethics together, like a whole map for living well. They believed mastering all parts was needed for flourishing, not just a handful of platitudes. If you want to stop being tossed by every slight or setback, you have to treat this like training, not a one-time pep talk. Let's turn this into a simple daily ritual you can actually do. Start each day anticipating disturbances, not to become pessimistic, but to be prepared. When you go through ordinary routines, imagine the small annoyances that could occur, someone rushing you, a line moving slowly, some glitch. Prepare your mind by saying, I will maintain my inner calm regardless. When the actual annoyance hits, it'll feel less like a storm and more like a passing cloud. That's not denial. That's practical conditioning. You're teaching yourself that calm is not a reward for perfect circumstances. Calm is your default stance, and the more you practice, the faster you realize the situation is temporary, but the peace you can keep is permanent. Here's one more layer most people miss: the difference between reacting and choosing. Reaction is automatic, fueled by the old survival wiring: anger, panic, blame. Choosing is conscious, aligned with your values. When you master the boundary of control, choosing becomes natural. It's less about suppressing emotion and more about deciding which emotion you let guide you, if any. Sometimes you'll feel heat, but you don't have to fuel it. You can let it pass, use it briefly as information, then move on. And because you're choosing, you're never a hostage to someone else's words or actions. That sense of ownership gives you an unshakable calm that no outsider can take away. So if your goal is to never again be helplessly angry or endlessly bothered by anyone or anything, this is the upgrade you need. Train your mind to distinguish control from illusion, interrupt judgment in real time, and choose your response. You're not forcing yourself into robotic silence. You're stepping into the strongest position any human can hold, free from the tyranny of external chaos, anchored in your own inner command. Master that, and anger loses its throne, disturbance loses its grip, and you walk through the world with a quiet power that others will sense, but can't steal. And here's where it gets even deeper, because once you understand control on an intellectual level, the real work becomes emotional discipline. Most people think Stoicism is about not feeling, but that's a shallow misunderstanding. The Stoics never denied emotion. They studied how emotions arise and how they spiral when left unchecked. Anger, for example, doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It's built in stages. First comes the impression, the raw moment, something happens. Then comes the judgment, this shouldn't have happened. This is disrespectful. This is unfair. That second step is where most people lose their power. When you train yourself to delay judgment, even for a few seconds, you create a gap. And inside that gap is freedom. That pause is where anger either dies or turns into wisdom. What makes this so transformative is realizing how often we give other people authority over our inner state without even noticing. Someone raises their voice, and suddenly your peace is gone. Someone ignores you, and suddenly your worth feels questioned. Stoicism exposes this as a kind of silent surrender. You're handing the keys of your emotional home to anyone who knocks hard enough. When you truly grasp this, it becomes almost embarrassing how much power you used to give away. The Stoic response isn't arrogance or indifference, it's sovereignty. You decide that no external person gets to dictate your internal weather. Storms can pass by, but they don't have to move in. Another uncomfortable truth the Stoics force us to face is this: many of our emotional reactions are habits, not necessities. We say, I can't help it, that's just how I am, but that's rarely true. What's really happening is that the mind has been rewarded for reacting a certain way over time. Anger feels powerful, victimhood feels justified, resentment feels protective, but those rewards are short-lived, and the cost is long-term disturbance. Stoicism interrupts that cycle by asking you to value long-term peace over short-term emotional release. When you stop feeding those old reactions, they weaken. Slowly, the mind learns a new pattern: calm first, clarity second, action last. There's also a brutal honesty in Stoicism that many people resist at first. If you are constantly offended, constantly bothered, constantly angry, the common denominator isn't the world, it's your expectations. Expectations are silent contracts we make with reality, and reality never signs them. You expect people to be fair, to be respectful, to be self-aware. When they aren't, you feel betrayed. Stoicism teaches you to release those unrealistic expectations without becoming cynical. You stop demanding that the world conform to your preferences and start working with the world as it is. That shift alone removes an enormous amount of suffering. One of the most powerful mental exercises the Stoics practiced was imagining loss, not in a morbid way, but in a grounding way. When you remind yourself that status, comfort, approval, and even relationships are temporary, insults lose their sharp edge. If everything external is already fragile, why cling so tightly to any single outcome or opinion? This isn't pessimism, it's perspective. When you accept impermanence, You stop panicking over every disturbance. You stop clinging. You stop grasping. And paradoxically, you start enjoying life more because you're no longer terrified of losing it. At a certain point, something subtle but profound happens. You notice that situations that used to trigger you barely register anymore, not because you've numbed yourself, but because your identity has shifted. You're no longer someone who reacts, you're someone who observes. You watch emotions rise and fall without immediately identifying with them. And when you do choose to act, it's deliberate, measured, and aligned with your values. That's the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. It's quiet, steady, and immovable. This is why mastering this Stoic principle changes everything. You don't become untouchable because the world becomes nicer. You become untouchable because your mind becomes disciplined. Disrespect loses its sting. Chaos loses its urgency. Other people's moods stop dictating your own. And the more you practice this, the more you realize something almost shocking. Peace was never something you needed to find. It was something you needed to stop giving away. What truly separates those who master this and those who merely admire it is consistency under pressure. Anyone can talk about calm when life is quiet, but Stoicism was designed for moments when your buttons are pushed hard, when disrespect feels personal, when injustice feels sharp, when emotions demand immediate release. In those moments, the trained mind doesn't ask, "How do I win this argument?" It asks, "Who am I choosing to be right now?" That question alone shifts you from reaction to authority. And once you start living this way, you notice something strange. People may still try to provoke you, but their efforts land differently. Their words hit a kind of emotional armor. Not because you're numb, but because you're anchored. This is exactly why so many people feel drawn to Stoicism today, even if they don't realize it yet. In a world that thrives on outrage, outrage becomes exhausting. Constant emotional reactivity drains focus, energy, and self-respect. Stoicism offers something radically different: inner order. It teaches you that dignity isn't something others grant you, it's something you practice. And the more you practice it, the more your presence alone begins to change how others interact with you. People sense when someone can't be easily rattled. That calm becomes magnetic. If this way of thinking is resonating with you, if you feel that quiet recognition that says this is what I've been missing, then this channel is built for you. Psychovest exists for people who are done being emotionally dragged around by circumstances, opinions, and chaos. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Not for the algorithm, but because mastering your inner world is one of the most important skills you can ever develop, and this is just the beginning. Once you commit to this mindset, you begin to see how often anger is not strength, but leakage, energy spilling into places that don't deserve it. You start valuing your peace the way others value attention or approval. And when peace becomes non-negotiable, everything changes. How you speak, how you listen, how you move through conflict. You no longer need to dominate conversations or prove yourself right. Silence becomes powerful. Restraint becomes confidence. And the world, strangely enough, starts meeting you with more respect. Not because you demanded it, but because you no longer chase it. As this discipline deepens, you start to notice how much of modern life is designed to keep you emotionally reactive. News cycles thrive on outrage, social media rewards provocation, and even everyday conversations subtly encourage you to take things personally. Stoicism cuts through all of that noise by training you to observe before you absorb. Instead of immediately identifying with every thought or emotion that arises, you learn to stand slightly apart from them, like a watchman at the gate of your mind. Not every impression deserves entry. Not every thought deserves belief. This single shift changes how you experience the world, because you're no longer living inside every mental storm that passes through you. Over time, You also realize that many conflicts don't actually require resolution. They dissolve when you stop feeding them. When someone tries to pull you into drama, argument, or emotional chaos, your refusal to engage at the same level often ends the situation faster than any clever response ever could. Silence, restraint, and calm become strategic rather than passive. This doesn't mean you never speak up or set boundaries. It means when you do, your words carry weight because they're not fueled by ego or heat. You respond from clarity, not compulsion. And clarity has a way of unsettling those who rely on reaction to feel powerful. Another quiet transformation happens in how you view yourself. When your mood is no longer dependent on praise, validation, or external approval, your sense of identity stabilizes. You stop asking, "How do I look to others?" and start asking, "Am I acting in alignment with my values?" That internal metric replaces the need for constant reassurance. Even criticism begins to lose its sting because you evaluate it calmly. Is there something useful here or not? If yes, you take it. If not, you discard it without resentment. Either way, you remain intact. You also begin to understand that calm is not weakness, it's efficiency. Emotional overreaction consumes enormous mental energy. It fragments attention, clouds judgment, and pulls you away from what actually matters. Stoicism reclaims that energy. When you're not burning fuel on anger, anxiety, or resentment, you suddenly have space to think, plan, and move deliberately. Life feels less rushed, less chaotic. You're not constantly recovering from emotional whiplash. You're steady, and that steadiness compounds over time, quietly improving every area of your life. What surprises most people is how this inner discipline affects relationships. When you stop needing others to behave a certain way in order for you to be okay, your interactions become cleaner and more honest. You listen better, you argue less, you tolerate less nonsense without becoming hostile. You're no longer negotiating from insecurity or fear of loss. That changes the dynamic entirely. Some people adjust and meet you at that level. Others drift away when they realize they can't control or provoke you anymore. Either outcome brings clarity, and clarity always simplifies life. Eventually, you reach a point where being unbothered no longer feels like an effort. It becomes your baseline. Disturbances still happen, but they don't linger. Emotions arise, but they don't rule. You act when action is needed, and let go when it's not. And in that state, something profound settles in, a sense of inner independence. You're no longer waiting for the world to calm down so you can feel at peace. You've learned how to carry peace with you, regardless of the noise around you. As you continue living this way, you begin to notice how rare true self-mastery actually is. Most people are not guided by intention, they are guided by impulse. Their moods shift with tone, timing, and circumstance. One careless word can ruin their afternoon. One inconvenience can dominate their thoughts for hours. When you step out of that pattern, it's almost like watching life from a higher elevation. You see reactions forming before they explode. You recognize emotional traps as they're being set. And because you're no longer desperate to defend your ego at every turn, you gain something far more valuable than being right. You gain clarity. That clarity changes how you experience hardship. Challenges stop feeling like personal attacks and start looking like raw material for growth. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What is this training me to become?" Stoicism reframes difficulty as a proving ground rather than a punishment. Every irritation becomes an opportunity to practice restraint. Every delay becomes a lesson in patience. Every insult becomes a test of self-command. And the more you pass these tests quietly, the more resilient your inner structure becomes. There's also a deep psychological relief that comes from no longer narrating yourself as a victim. Victimhood keeps the mind locked in replay, reliving the offense, rehearsing comebacks, fantasizing about justice. Stoicism breaks that loop by removing the story altogether. You don't need a villain to explain your emotions. You don't need an enemy to justify your peace. When you stop narrating life as something happening to you, you reclaim the role of author. And authors don't panic when a chapter gets difficult. They keep writing. With time, your relationship to time itself begins to change. You're no longer rushed by urgency that isn't real. You stop mistaking noise for importance. When others are frantic, you're deliberate. When others are reactive, you're still. That doesn't mean you move slowly. It means you move precisely. Decisions improve. Regret diminishes. You waste less energy recovering from emotional fallout because there's less fallout to begin with. Eventually, this mindset creates a kind of internal silence, not emptiness, but spaciousness. Thoughts still arise, emotions still come and go, but they no longer crowd you. You're not constantly arguing with reality in your head. You're present, grounded, capable of acting without inner friction. And in that silence, something powerful settles in. Confidence that doesn't need validation, strength that doesn't need dominance, and peace that doesn't depend on the world cooperating. This is what it really means to master yourself, not to control others, not to dominate circumstances, but to remain internally free no matter what appears in front of you. And once that freedom is established, anger has nowhere to live, because there is no longer a mind willing to host it. As this freedom becomes familiar, you start to see how much of your old stress came from unnecessary mental resistance. You were fighting reality, arguing with the past, demanding different behavior from people who had no intention of changing. Stoicism doesn't ask you to like what happens. It asks you to stop adding friction to what already exists. When you remove that friction, life feels lighter, even when it's heavy. You carry difficulty without being crushed by it. You respond instead of react. And in that shift, emotional maturity quietly replaces emotional volatility. What's striking is how this inner shift begins to ripple outward. When you're no longer easily provoked, you stop attracting chaos. People sense when their usual tactics won't work. Guilt, pressure, manipulation, emotional bait. Conversations become cleaner. Boundaries become clearer. You don't need to announce them or defend them aggressively. Your calm enforces them naturally. This is one of the most underestimated forms of power, the ability to remain centered while others lose balance. You also begin to recognize that peace is not passive. It's disciplined. It's built through repetition, through small daily choices to pause, observe, and choose wisely. Every time you refuse to escalate, every time you let an insult pass without internalizing it, every time you redirect your attention toward what you can control, you are reinforcing a new identity. You are no longer someone who is at the mercy of circumstance. You are someone who governs themselves. If this way of thinking is helping you see your own reactions differently, take a moment to like this video so it reaches others who are quietly struggling with anger and overwhelm. Subscribe to Psychovest if you want more content that strengthens emotional control, inner peace, and mental resilience. And share this with someone who is tired of feeling reactive and wants to regain authority over their inner world. This isn't just philosophy, it's a skill, and skills get sharper when they're practiced together. As you continue applying this mindset, life stops feeling like something you're constantly bracing against. You move with it, not against it. You conserve your energy for what truly matters. And slowly, without force or performance, you become someone who is difficult to shake. Not because nothing goes wrong, but because nothing unnecessary is allowed to take root inside you. As this way of being settles in, you start to experience a subtle but powerful detachment, not from life, but from unnecessary suffering. You still care, you still feel, but you no longer cling. You stop gripping every outcome as if your identity depends on it. Wins are appreciated without arrogance. Losses are processed without collapse. This balance creates emotional stability that feels almost unfamiliar at first, especially if you've spent years riding emotional highs and lows. But over time, that steadiness becomes deeply reassuring. You trust yourself more because you know you won't abandon your values the moment pressure appears. You also begin to see how much of your former anger was actually fear in disguise. Fear of being disrespected, overlooked, misunderstood, or powerless. Stoicism doesn't shame you for that fear. It dissolves it by removing its leverage. When your worth is no longer negotiated externally, fear loses its voice. You don't need to prove yourself. You don't need to defend your image. You don't need to win every exchange. And when those needs fall away, anger follows them out the door. Another transformation happens in moments of solitude. Silence stops feeling uncomfortable. Stillness stops feeling empty. Without constant mental noise, you become more aware of your own thoughts and more selective about which ones you entertain. You begin to notice how often the mind exaggerates, catastrophizes, or dramatizes. Instead of believing every thought, you examine it. Is this useful? Is this true? Is this within my control? That quiet interrogation becomes second nature, and the mind grows calmer as a result. You may also notice that your tolerance for meaningless conflict drops sharply. Arguments that once felt urgent now feel optional. Drama that once pulled you in now feels heavy and avoidable. This isn't withdrawal, it's refinement. You're no longer interested in emotional noise. You value clarity, simplicity, and depth. And because your standards have changed internally, your external life begins to reorganize itself around that calm. Over time, you realize something essential. Peace is not the absence of problems. It's the presence of self-trust. You trust that no matter what arises, you will meet it with composure. You trust that you don't need to control the world to remain whole. That trust becomes a quiet confidence, one that doesn't seek attention or validation. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, even when circumstances fluctuate. And in that state, life feels less like a battle and more like a practice. Not a practice you ever finish, but one that keeps refining you. Each moment becomes another chance to respond with wisdom instead of impulse, with discipline instead of emotion, with calm instead of chaos. And the more you live this way, the clearer it becomes. Nothing outside of you ever had the power you once believed it did. As this realization deepens, you begin to notice how differently you move through moments that once felt overwhelming. Situations that used to demand an emotional reaction now invite a measured response. You don't rush to label things as good or bad, right or wrong. You let events reveal themselves before assigning meaning. This patience gives you an edge most people never develop, the ability to see clearly while others are blinded by urgency. And clarity, more than force or emotion, is what leads to sound decisions. You also start to understand that being unbothered is not about avoiding responsibility. In fact, it sharpens your sense of responsibility. When emotions are no longer running the show, you can see your role in every situation more accurately. You take ownership where it's appropriate and release blame where it isn't. This balance prevents both self-punishment and finger-pointing. You stop wasting energy on guilt that serves no purpose, and you stop indulging anger that solves nothing. What remains is accountability, clean, focused, and effective. There's a moment, often unnoticed at first, when your internal dialogue begins to soften. The constant commentary, the harsh self-talk, the inner arguments lose their intensity. You're no longer policing yourself with fear or shame. Instead, you guide yourself with reason. When you make a mistake, you correct it without cruelty. When you fall short, you adjust without drama. This shift alone can feel like a kind of liberation, especially if you've lived under the pressure of perfectionism or self-criticism. As this internal order strengthens, you may find yourself less interested in external comparison. Other people's success no longer threatens you. Their approval no longer defines you. Their disapproval no longer wounds you. You're grounded in something more stable than opinion. And from that grounding, genuine confidence grows, not loud or performative, but quiet and durable. You don't need to announce your strength because you feel it internally. You also begin to recognize that life's unpredictability is not an enemy, it's a constant. The Stoic mind doesn't demand certainty to function well. It adapts, it prepares, it remains flexible without becoming fragile. When plans change, you adjust. When outcomes disappoint, you recalibrate. When challenges appear, you meet them without panic. This adaptability becomes one of your greatest assets, allowing you to stay composed even when the ground shifts beneath you. And gradually, something profound settles in, a sense of inner sufficiency. You no longer feel incomplete without certain outcomes, people, or circumstances. You enjoy them when they're present, but you don't collapse when they're gone. This doesn't make life dull. It makes it rich without being fragile. You experience joy without clinging, effort without desperation, and peace without conditions. In this state, anger has very little room to grow. It's not suppressed. It simply doesn't find the same foothold. You've learned how to meet life directly, without distortion, without excess, without surrendering control of your inner world. And that mastery, once developed, quietly reshapes everything that follows. As this mastery continues to mature, you begin to recognize that true calm is not something you perform. It's something you inhabit. You're no longer trying to appear unbothered. You simply are. There's no tension in holding yourself together because there's nothing being held back. You're not suppressing emotion, and you're not indulging it either. You let it move through you, take what's useful, and release the rest. That balance creates an inner stability that doesn't crack under pressure. You also become more aware of how often people confuse intensity with importance. Loud emotions, urgent reactions, dramatic responses, they all give the illusion that something must be addressed immediately. Stoicism trains you to question that illusion. You learn that not every feeling deserves action, and not every moment requires a response. This discernment saves you from countless unnecessary conflicts and regrets. You act when action matters, and you stay still when stillness is wiser. There's a quiet confidence that emerges from this way of living, one that doesn't need to be reinforced through dominance or control. You're no longer compelled to win conversations or prove points. You listen more than you speak, and when you do speak, it's intentional. Words carry weight because they're not reactive. People may not always agree with you, but they feel your presence differently, steady, composed, grounded. You may also notice that setbacks stop defining your narrative. Instead of labeling experiences as failures, you see them as feedback. Each misstep becomes information rather than condemnation. This reframing removes the emotional charge from mistakes and replaces it with learning. Growth becomes continuous rather than conditional. You're no longer waiting to feel confident before acting. You act, learn, adjust, and move forward without unnecessary self-judgment. As this internal discipline strengthens, your sense of timing improves. You're no longer rushed by impatience or driven by fear of missing out. You understand that progress unfolds over time, and forcing outcomes often creates resistance. This patience allows you to invest your energy where it actually compounds, into habits, decisions, and values that shape your future quietly but powerfully. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust yourself in a way that feels deeply grounding. You trust that you can face discomfort without being undone by it. You trust that you don't need external chaos to settle before you feel okay. That trust becomes a foundation, one that supports you through uncertainty, change, and challenge without collapsing. In that space, life feels less like something you must control and more like something you can meet with readiness. You're not bracing for impact anymore. You're prepared, present, and internally free, regardless of what unfolds next. As this readiness becomes second nature, you start to sense a deeper alignment between who you are and how you act. There's less inner contradiction, less self-betrayal. You're no longer saying yes when you mean no, reacting when silence would serve you better, or chasing outcomes that don't actually reflect your values. That inner alignment creates a calm confidence that doesn't fluctuate with circumstances. You're not fragmented anymore. You're whole in your decisions, even when those decisions are difficult. You also become more comfortable with uncertainty. Where others panic when outcomes aren't guaranteed, you remain steady. Stoicism trains you to invest fully in effort, not in results. You show up, you prepare, you act with integrity, and then you release the outcome. This detachment doesn't reduce motivation, it sharpens it. You work harder because your energy isn't wasted on anxiety. You take risks without emotional desperation. And when things don't go as planned, you adapt instead of spiraling. Over time, you notice how rarely you feel the need to explain yourself. When you're grounded in your principles, justification becomes unnecessary. You don't rush to defend your choices or seek approval for your path. You let your actions speak quietly over time. This restraint often unsettles people who rely on validation or conflict to feel significant, but it frees you completely. You stop negotiating your worth in conversations that were never meant to honor it. There's also a growing sense of respect for yourself and for life as it is. You respect your limits without resentment. You respect others without idealizing them. You respect reality without resistance. That respect creates balance. You're firm without being rigid, compassionate without being weak, detached without being cold. You move through life with a steadiness that doesn't draw attention, but commands it nonetheless. Gradually, you realize that most suffering comes not from pain itself, but from the stories we attach to pain. Stoicism doesn't erase pain. It strips away the unnecessary narrative. Without that narrative, pain becomes manageable, temporary, and often instructive. You feel it, learn from it, and let it pass. You don't carry it forward as identity or grievance, and because of that, you remain light even after heavy experiences. At this stage, being unbothered no longer feels like a goal. It feels like a byproduct of self-knowledge, discipline, and deliberate choice. You don't wake up trying to control your emotions. You wake up grounded in principles that naturally guide them. And from that grounding, life unfolds with less friction, fewer regrets, and a quiet sense of inner freedom that nothing external can truly disturb. At the end of all of this, the truth is simple, even if it took a lifetime to uncover. Nothing outside of you ever had the authority you once believed it did. Not people, not circumstances, not approval, rejection, success, or loss. The power was always internal, quiet, waiting, untouched by the chaos you mistook for control. Stoicism doesn't promise a world without difficulty. It gives you something far more valuable, a mind that cannot be conquered by it. When you stop outsourcing your peace, anger loses its leverage. When you stop demanding reality behave differently, suffering loosens its grip. And when you learn to govern your inner world, the outer world stops feeling like a threat. You move forward not hardened, not detached, but grounded, steady in the knowledge that no matter what happens, you remain intact. This is not emotional suppression, this is mastery. And once you've tasted that kind of freedom, you never again mistake disturbance for power or reaction for strength.